Imagine waking up to silence. Not the comfortable silence of a peaceful morning, but the hollow, pressing quiet of a world stripped of power. No hum of a furnace, no glow from a streetlight cutting through frosted glass, no reassuring tick of a thermostat clicking on. For millions of civilians living in the shadow of the Cold War, this was not a hypothetical. It was Tuesday. It was January. And surviving it required a depth of practical ingenuity that most of us have quietly forgotten. This is Fieldcraft Chronicles, and today we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most overlooked chapters in survival history: the grassroots, kitchen table, basement and blanket strategies that ordinary men and women developed to endure brutal winters without electricity, without central heating, and often without any meaningful government support reaching their door in time to matter. The first lesson these civilians learned, and often the hard way, was that you cannot heat a house and you heat a space. Across Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and the war-scarred urban centres of post-war Germany and Poland, families made the quiet, deliberate decision to abandon most of their home to the cold and defend a single room with everything they had. Heavy curtains, wool blankets nailed across door frames, towels stuffed into the gaps beneath doors. Every crack and seam became a battlefield against wind chill. This principle, which survivalists today call thermal refuging, was not born from a government pamphlet. It emerged from lived experience, passed between neighbours over backyard fences and kitchen tables, a family that had endured the winters of the 1940s, occupation, bombardment, the collapse of municipal infrastructure, carried that knowledge forward into the Cold War decades with grim authority. They knew that a single candle inside a well-sealed, heavily insulated room could raise the ambient temperature by several degrees. They knew that body heat was a resource to be pooled, not wasted. Families slept together, layered clothing they would never have worn indoors in peacetime, and treated warmth as something earned rather than assumed. When central heating disappeared, the improvised stove became the heartbeat of the household. In rural communities particularly, wood and coal had never fully surrendered their role to modernity, and those families found themselves unexpectedly advantaged. A cast-iron stove, properly vented through an existing chimney or through a carefully cut wall aperture, could sustain a family through weeks of grid failure. Urban dwellers faced a steeper climb. Furniture became fuel. Carefully rationed, yes, a chair burned today was a chair you couldn't sit in tomorrow. But when temperatures inside a city apartment dropped toward freezing, sentiment gave way to survival calculus. What made these improvised heating setups remarkable wasn't just their function, but their sophistication. Civilians learned to bank fires overnight, loading a stove with dense hardwood or compacted coal dust before sleeping so that embers survived until morning. They learned the difference between a fire built for warmth and one built for cooking, the former slow and sustained, the latter hot and brief. These were ancient skills, reawakened by necessity, and they travelled between households the way recipes do, adjusted, improved and shared. Survival in a powerless winter was ultimately a mathematics problem, and the currency was time. How long could you sustain life on what you had stored before outside resupply became possible? Civilians who had internalized this question before a crisis arrived were the ones who endured it most effectively. Root cellars packed with preserved vegetables, shelves lined with canned goods and dried legumes, water stored in every available vessel before pipes froze. These weren't paranoid behaviors. They were the practical inheritance of generations who remembered scarcity as something real and recent. Water presented, perhaps, the most immediate danger. When pipes froze and the municipal supply failed, civilians turned to snowmelt, carefully filtered and boiled, even when fuel was, really scarce. They prioritized ruthlessly, drinking water first, cooking water second, and, washing a distant third. Personal hygiene adapted accordingly, with dry washing techniques and carefully conserved warm water used for the most critical sanitation needs. This wasn't comfortable, but it was effective, and it kept communities functional across, honestly, weeks and months of sustained hardship. Perhaps the most profound survival tool of the Cold War civilian winter was the one you cannot store in a basement or ration across a calendar: community. The informal networks that formed between neighbors in these periods of crisis operated with a quiet efficiency that formal civil defense structures rarely matched. An elderly woman with a working wood stove became a node in a neighborhood survival system. A man with mechanical knowledge kept shared generators running. Families with surplus food traded with those who had surplus fuel. These weren't organized programs. They were human instincts, activated by shared vulnerability. Civil defense planners of the era consistently underestimated this dimension. Their models assumed populations would flow towards centralized public shelters and designated distribution points. But in practice, most people stayed close to home, close to people they trusted, and built resilience from the ground up. The lesson embedded in that instinct remains as relevant today as it was during the tensest decades of the 20th century. There is something, quietly profound about studying the survival strategies of people who faced the worst without drama, without cameras, and without any guarantee that spring would bring relief. They adapted, they improvised, they leaned on each other, and in doing so they preserved not just their own lives, but a body of practical knowledge that the modern world has been perhaps dangerously quick to discard. The Fieldcraft of the Cold War civilian winter isn't a museum exhibit. It's a living curriculum, one that speaks directly to anyone serious about preparedness, self-reliance, and really the honest acknowledgement that infrastructure is more fragile than we like to believe. These men and women didn't wait for rescue. They built warmth from wood and wool and human proximity, and they endured. That's the tradition Fieldcraft Chronicles exists to honor and continue. If this episode opened your eyes to a chapter of survival history you'd never considered before, go ahead and hit subscribe and share this video with someone who values history, self-reliance, and the enduring art of human adaptability. Fieldcraft Chronicles is built by and for people who believe that the most important skills are the ones we've almost forgotten, and that relearning them might matter more than we think.